All right, everyone, hello.
Hello, Greg.
Hello, welcome. I'll be the first to officially welcome everyone to our Scientonomy Year in Review. So it's the Science of Science, our annual meeting. We're going to start off by going over what's happened, what's transpired in the last 12 months. We met here in January 2016, beginning of February now, 2017. So I just want to give a little bit of an overview of the Scientonomy workflow that we've developed. You'll see this a few more times in the next few presentations, but this is kind of a centerpiece for how we envisage our work in the Scientonomy community. First of all, just to remind everyone, the Scientowiki, the encyclopedia of Scientonomy, which is online, the main goal of which is to kind of fix the current state of knowledge in the Scientonomy community and to keep track of any suggested modifications. A little more detail on these a little bit later. Then there's the seminar, which many of you are familiar with, many of you are products of, where we meet to scrutinize our current knowledge of the theory, to inculcate new people into the theory and teach it to them, and also to formulate open questions. The journal, of course, we have a peer-reviewed journal where our main goal is to try to answer open questions and suggest new modifications for our knowledge in Scientonomy. And then we have the possibility of a workshop, which would be designed in order to facilitate resolving contentious modifications that we might have. So we're going to start with just a review. Looking back at January 2016, this is roughly where we stuck the progress in each one of these four parts of the workflow. As you could see, the seminar was in full swing. It has been since 2013. We were just starting off rolling on the online encyclopedia of Scientonomy. The journal was a little bit more than an idea. We had done some strategy work, and the workshop was kind of conceived of in principle, but not yet rolling. So this was last year, about 13 months ago. And now we're going to go into and tell you exactly what has transpired over the last 12 to 13 months. So we're going to start with the online encyclopedia of Scientonomy. So we launched it officially in February of 2016, exactly a year ago. And a lot of the programming work, the coding work, the semantic backbone, which Jakob will tell you a little bit more about, was done over the summer in August of this past year. Marc Loisel and Zachary Brown were the first co-editors of the encyclopedia. And since September 2016, Paul Patton has been the editor-in-chief. So it has gone from a concept to a live online Wikipedia-style encyclopedia. This is an example of one of the many topic pages that we have on the online encyclopedia. This one's for the mechanism of method employment. As you can see, it is rather comprehensive, and it's an impressive stride from where we were last year. In addition to these topic pages, which you might be familiar with from just a regular Wikipedia page, we also keep track of the modifications that have been suggested in our published and peer-reviewed articles. So the online encyclopedia not only gives online users access to the current state of scientonomic knowledge, but also allows users to go online and actually discover what has been suggested as potential modifications for Scientonomy. And not only do we have listed the modifications themselves, but we also have the functionality to discuss these modifications. So this is kind of the main way in which the Scientonomy community can access the modifications to begin to discuss these modifications and hopefully reach some sort of consensus on these modifications. So that's it for the online encyclopedia for now. Jakob will say quite a bit more on the online encyclopedia in the next talk. So on to the seminar then. The seminar has been held annually since 2013 at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology here at U of T. Over the years, it has produced many important open questions that later became topics for original research. Now, it's taken a few years for the seminar to kind of hit its stride. It started off as really an opportunity for new people to become aware of and familiar with the theory of scientific change that we work on, and started off as a chance to not only discuss it, but to perhaps brainstorm. But in recent years, it's become very clear that the most productive use of that time would be also to formulate new open questions. And that has been kind of the guiding purpose of the seminar for the last few years. As you can see here, the Scientonomy seminar from last year produced a number of new open questions that we've added to our kind of ongoing list of open questions. So this is also clearly accessible via the encyclopedia of Scientonomy online. So anyone who's hoping to write a paper, for instance, can check out the list of possible open questions. Until now, the seminar participants have been the winners of the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology's annual award for the best essay on the theory of scientific change. It doesn't have to be that way. And here we have the winners in our presence of the 2016 award, Matt Mercury, who's here, and Mirka Loisel, also her disembodied form here on the slide, but she's here with us in the flesh today, which is nice. So that's the seminar. Now moving on to the journal. The Journal of Scientonomy, we launched it officially this past September 2016. It is a peer-reviewed academic journal, and we've just named it Scientonomy. Haka Barsegyan, Nick Overgaard, Paul Patton, and myself are its current co-editors. This is what the journal looks like currently online. When you access it and click on any of the published papers, you quickly get an overview of the abstract, number of the keywords, the main proposed modifications, including a reference list. But clicking on any of the actual papers brings you to a PhD, excuse me. Clicking on each of them, yeah, I wish. If only it were that easy. Clicking on any of them will bring you to a PDF of the actual paper, which we've cleaned up and presented, I think, beautifully. These papers are also available freely. It's an open access journal. Also, at the end of each one of these papers, as part of the way that we've asked authors to actually write these papers and to format them, each one culminates with a list of suggested modifications. So this is the place that you would go in order to find the most kind of robust defense, the most robust argument for any one of these modifications that are being proposed to our current scientonomic knowledge. But as I mentioned before, each one of these modifications, at least in brief, would be mentioned on the actual Encyclopedia of Scientonomy online once it's been published. So if you were to visit the website right now, you would see that there have been several articles that have already been gone through the entire process of peer review and publishing, and they are available right now. There are many more in the works, and they will all be published very, very shortly. Every one of these papers, as I mentioned, would at least propose one modification to our scientonomic knowledge. Because of the number of published papers that we have, and because each one of them has suggested more than one modification, we have a number of modifications that have been suggested for our current scientonomic theory. We have a suggestion for a new third law and the solution to the paradox of normative propositions. We have a new taxonomy for theory, normative theory, and descriptive theory, a new proposed ontology of scientific change, including both descriptive and normative theories, the concept of authority delegation, the concept of mutual and one-sided authority delegation, indicators of theory acceptance in the medieval Arabic scientific mosaic, new formulation of the second law, inferences of theory assessment outcomes from theory acceptance or unacceptance, a new taxonomy for social agents of scientific change, group, community, etc., and the concept of multiple and hierarchical authority delegation. At this point in the talk, I'm going to take you through a number of these modifications because they are relatively significant. And I think that it does demonstrate both the quality, the attention of the work that's being done in the community and has been done over the last 13 months. So we're going to start with the new third law and the solution to the paradox of normative propositions. First, we have to start off with the paradox of normative propositions. We're proposing a solution here, so what's the problem? So as we know, any mosaic is made up of accepted theories and employed methods. These are the two main elements that we consider mosaics to be made up of. So for an employed method, we would say that by the third law, as it currently stands, an employed method is in part a deductive consequence of the theories accepted at that time. So these employed methods will be shaped by accepted theories. We also know, though, that methodologies are often part of the mosaic. So a methodology would be a kind of explicit set of rules that a scientific community might write up for how they think they ought to assess new and incoming theories into the mosaic, contender theories. Since accepted methodologies are themselves theories, employed methods should also be a deductive consequence of those methodologies. Now, glancing at the history of science, however, we can point to a number of different examples where the explicitly accepted methodology is not actually how the scientific community would determine that a new theory is a better theory, that that theory ought to be accepted. So, because methodologies and methods seem to sometimes be at odds in history, this is a problem. How can an employed method conflict with the accepted methodology from which it is purportedly derived? So this is a problem. The third law, as it stood not too long ago, kind of our original version, read thusly. A method becomes employed only when it is deducible from other employed methods and accepted theories of the time. In order to bypass and help us solve this paradox of normative propositions, our own Zoe Sebastian, who's here, has proposed a new formulation of the third law, which reads, a method becomes employed only when it is deducible from some subset of other employed methods and accepted theories of the time. Now, this seemingly small change, this little clause, some subset of, actually does allow us to completely bypass the problem. By the new third law, an employed method is deducible from some accepted theories and some employed methods, not all of the accepted theories and all of the employed methods. And thus, when an employed method and an accepted methodology do contradict each other, it simply indicates that the employed method was not, in fact, deduced from the accepted methodology. So by the zeroth law, too, it's possible for an employed method and an accepted methodology to contradict each other and to nevertheless be compatible within the same mosaic. So because of this, the paradox is resolved. So a pretty big step forward, I think, even just in this first example, within our theoretical Scientonomy. Now let's take a look at the concept of authority delegation. So let's start with a beautiful analogy that was actually set out within the paper itself, which proposed this modification. So if we look at the community of art experts, among other things that they do in the world, including understanding and appreciating good artworks and their histories, they also have to assess whether certain artworks are in fact authentic. And they have a set of criteria that they use to determine whether one of these artworks is in fact an authentic work of art from the person who is purported to have painted it. So the method employed by the art experts these days can be explicated roughly along these lines. A work of art is considered authentic if it satisfies the requirements of provenance, where it comes from, dating, which they have a number of different methods for determining the actual date of the painting, and connoisseurship, which also factors into whether or not it is judged as an authentic piece of art. But there's another community that has a horse in this race, as it were, the art market community, who want to know whether an art piece is authentic so that they could sell it at the appropriate price, or not buy it, for instance. So what criteria would the art market community use to determine whether a piece of artwork is in fact authentic? Well, they would defer judgment to the art experts. A work of art is considered authentic if art experts say so. And we say now that these two communities are in a relationship of authority delegation. And as you can see in the diagram, the arrow, for lack of a better word right now, is going from right to left, showing that the delegation is coming from the art market community to the art expert community. And they delegate authority to the art experts. This is the definition that we currently have of authority delegation. Community A is said to be delegating authority over topic X to community B if and only if, 1, community A accepts that community B is an expert on topic X, and 2, community A will accept a theory on topic X if community B says so. This definition of authority delegation was proposed by Nick Overgaard and Mirka Loisel. Authority delegation is fully reducible to theories and methods, which is kind of a nice bonus for us. We're not talking about some brand new ontological element in the mosaic. We can explain it simply as the acceptance of this theory. Community B is an expert on topic X, a generic method that states that we should really only accept the best available theories, and we could follow with this new method that we should accept the theories of community B on topic X. Authority delegation is nothing but a combination of these two. So looking at a more maybe intuitively scientific example, let's say the community of physicists. Now, physicists would say that a theory concerning physical phenomena is acceptable if it meets the requirements of the hypothetico-deductive method, generally, right? We look at the community of metaphysicians over on the other side. Under which condition would metaphysicians accept the existence of, say, microparticles? Well, they would do so by delegating authority to the physicists. A theory concerning physical phenomena is acceptable if physicists say so, right? So we designate the authority delegation thusly in our typical graphic fashion in our diagrams. And this is another example which hits, I think, a little closer to home as an example between communities who are trying to gain knowledge about the world. Does anyone have any questions so far on those two modifications?
The example you first gave, the art expert community and the art market community, is an example of a relationship between an epistemic community that's primary goal is to generate new knowledge, and an applications community whose primary goal is to sell pictures. They're not in the business of generating new knowledge, which might require them to assess the knowledge generated by the art experts. That seems to be a very specialized case. In the case of the two epistemic communities you mentioned then, the metaphysical community and the physics community, now I would doubt that the metaphysics community is always going to uncritically accept whatever the physicists say. If they think what the physicists say is conceptually flawed, they might question it. I wonder if the idea of authority delegation as currently defined applies to only a very small number of cases, those cases being relationships between epistemic communities and applications communities that aren't generating new knowledge.
No, I think that's a good point. I think the art market and art expert community is a very nice, tidy example, right? Precisely for the reasons that you had mentioned. But I don't think that the relationship itself, this possibility of actually delegating authority from one epistemic community to another epistemic community, is necessarily undermined by the fact that the community doing the delegation might have some qualms as to what they would or would not accept. That being said, I think that easily we could think about situations where only certain amounts of authority are delegated, right? Perhaps the metaphysicians aren't going to say, we give physicists absolute reign over any claim about physical reality, maybe not. But for the existence of, say, a new microparticle, that sounds plausible. And I don't think that a metaphysician will necessarily say, I don't think anything of your technical apparatus was correct, or whatever they might be able to say in contention. Zoe?
I think even if you disagree with the relationship between the community of metaphysicians and the community of physicists, the actual definition of authority delegation as it stands would still hold. It has the two parts to it. So I think what you're pointing out is, number one might not actually be the case in the case of the community of metaphysicians. But if there were to be a kind of authority delegation happening, this kind of relationship and this explication of how that relationship would work, I think would still hold.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So typically, it's not a situation where biologists are just delegating authority to physicists by virtue of the fact that they're physicists and these are problems of physics. It's delegating authority to someone who has investigated that issue, right? And I trust that they've investigated that issue because their work has gone through some sort of a peer review process in a field that has a trustworthy peer review process. And so I'm delegating the authority of someone who has witnessed the event and that I don't have to witness it myself by virtue of the fact that I can't witness everything and I have to take it for granted that someone else has done so. So I think that maybe
that's a great
helps
point.
it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that if nothing else, this exchange that's even just happened right now is kind of a good example of the life in the community anyway. I mean, people are engaged with these topics, and I do think that that modification could be a fruitful one. And I mean, I'll say the same thing that I would say to anyone who's offering a modification at this point: write a paper. Submit it. All right, so on to the third of 4 modifications that I'll talk about today. Indicators of theory acceptance in the medieval Arabic scientific mosaic, which we will just abbreviate MASM, but I will likely say every time anyway. So one of the features, I think, of our scientonomic theory is that what it also allows us to do is practice something that we've called observational scientonomy, right? We're capable of using the conceptual tools, the theoretical tools that we're developing to go back and look at historical episodes, maybe learn something new about those episodes, maybe learn something new about our own theory and what it ought to have in it by looking at those episodes. So a goal here then for scientonomists would be able to look back over history and reconstruct mosaics of accepted beliefs and employed methods at any one time to explain changes between different mosaics. And this is a perfect example of a way that we've been able to use history to simultaneously inform our theory and to look back at a certain historical period that we, unfortunately, still haven't paid enough attention to. So suppose we wanted to reconstruct the medieval Arabic mosaic in the Abbasid Caliphate, which is roughly in this time period down here on the timeline at the bottom of the screen. This is roughly the geographic range of the Abbasid Caliphate in 906 CE. And our question then is, how could we, as observational scientonomists, tell that a certain theory was part of the mosaic in 906? Well, we would need to establish the relevant indicators of acceptance for that specific community. Now, traditionally, in a lot of the work that we've done thus far, which is based in Europe and based in kind of the classic focus of most people who are doing this kind of work, like the scientific revolution or thereabouts, the traditional list of possible indicators of theory acceptance have been things like textbooks, encyclopedias, university curricula, etc., which help to show us what the majority of the scientific community would have accepted at that point of time as being the best available theories. Michael Fatigati, who's here, showed us that this list doesn't apply to the medieval Arab scientific mosaic, and did some excellent work looking into that time period to demonstrate what might be promising indicators of theory acceptance during that time. This theory and method diagram is more or less informing our approach to that time period. These are not the theories and methods of the time. So education in the medieval Arab scientific mosaic was primarily done through explanation and memorization of authoritative texts. Now, that could lead us to accepting this general theory that authoritative texts are indicative of theories accepted in this mosaic. Now, just taking a general method for reconstructing a mosaic, a proposition can be said to be accepted in a mosaic if the best available indicators tell us that it was. We can derive a new employed method that a proposition can be said to be accepted in the medieval Arabic scientific mosaic if it is indicated as true in authoritative texts taught in that mosaic. Pretty straightforward so far, but how do we tell if a text is in fact authoritative? Well, licenses to teach are reliable indicators of which texts were considered authoritative in this mosaic. Taking that with our previously derived method, we could conclude that a proposition could be said to be accepted during this time period if the evidence of the licenses to teach indicates it so. So by looking at licenses to teach in order to discover what texts were considered authoritative, taking those steps would actually allow us to be able to properly assess what knowledge was in fact widely accepted and what methods were widely employed during that time. All right, the new formulation of the second law. The second law is our law for theory acceptance. So let's just quickly look at some assessment outcomes. So a theory can be assessed by a method of the time. The scientific community uses their method, their implicit requirements and expectations for what makes, in this case, a theory better than the theories that are already accepted. And that method can either be satisfied, not satisfied, or perhaps it could come to some sort of inconclusive outcome. It's right on the edge. Now, there are also a number of different outcomes for what happens to a theory, whether or not that theory is accepted or not. Namely, it is accepted, it remains unaccepted, or it is accepted in one community and unaccepted in another, in the case of something like mosaic split. Now, clearly the task of the law of theory acceptance should be to state what happens to a theory when a certain assessment outcome obtains. It should lead us from the method was satisfied, say, to a certain acceptance outcome. Unfortunately, those causal relations are not sketched out in the current version of the second law. This is the second law that we've been accepting for the last few years. In order to become accepted into the mosaic, a theory is assessed by the method actually employed at that time. And again, the only thing that this second law explicitly states is that a theory is assessed by that method, but it doesn't say what happens to a theory when a certain assessment outcome obtains. It doesn't actually entail any sort of acceptance or unacceptance. So the reformulated version does sketch out and tie together the assessment outcomes with the acceptance outcomes. It reads, if a theory satisfies the acceptance criteria of the method employed at the time, it becomes accepted into the mosaic. If it does not, it remains unaccepted. If assessment is inconclusive, the theory can be accepted or not accepted. So this formulation ends up doing the work that the original law was meant to do. We realized that that work was lacking in the content of the second law, and Paul Patton, Nick Overgaard, and Jakob Barsegyan all suggested this brand new formulation of the second law to explicitly lay out that causal connection between assessment outcomes and whether a theory would be accepted or not. So the new second law specifies the causal relationship between assessment outcomes. So it draws these kinds of lines between not satisfied leads to unaccepted, satisfied leads to accepted. And it also forbids some logically possible scenarios. For instance, according to the second law, the method can't be satisfied and then lead to unacceptance. Last but not least, let's just glance at the workshop. The workshop, again, is meant to be a time when people can gather together to discuss in more detail and at greater length any contentious modifications that have not yet reached any sort of status of either acceptance or rejection. And we just don't have enough of them yet, or at least we don't have any that are that contentious. So as of this point, the encyclopedia is working as well as it ought to. All those conversations are happening in the discussion boards on the online encyclopedia. And we haven't yet had to have a workshop, but the infrastructure's in place should we need to. The completion as of January 2016, about 13 months ago. And I think we can safely say that the journal is completely up and running. The encyclopedia will never really be done because we will always be adding things to it. And the workshop is still waiting for its time. But other than that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.